but with angry protest graffiti. To look at this wall, this is a different map, but it gives you some idea. Ignore the numbers. From the top here to the end, there's 730 kilometers. That is the same length as the wall. This wall is 730 kilometers from the Cedarburg to Mossel Bay, basically. And if you think the West Bank is only 130 kilometers long, this thing snakes its way all around the West Bank, completely dividing, breaking up communities. Just for comparison, the Cape Peninsula here is 50 kilometers long. Gaza is 45 kilometers long. Gaza is the size of the Cape Peninsula and pretty much the same width as well. It's got 2.5 million people. This is a very emotive photograph which I took on razor wire on the banks of the Jordan River when I was there. That's an endemic green bee eater, a beautiful word, and that picture tells a whole story. And then it was into Rafah, the Rafah checkpoint, the famous Rafah checkpoint, through a highly hostile Israeli checkpoint. Didn't want us coming in, doctors carrying cameras, binoculars, all that stuff. Had to go through the Hamas checkpoint as well, Hamas checkpoint, and we were in. And a view from our hotel. Absolutely stunning view out the Mediterranean. And you can see why Donald Trump wants to turn Gaza into a holiday resort for people, nice people just like us, and shoo the Palestinians into Jordan. Teaching the students, that's Mike Silver. He's another surgeon from Oxford. And we're teaching, these are IUG students, so the classes are separated by sex. AUG, they have shared classes. IUG is Islamic University of Gaza, and AUG is slightly less orthodox. This is teaching the nurses. And what I want you to see in these pictures is the incredible presentation. Everything's neat, tidy, full of pride. It's magnificent. Remember, Gaza has 2 or 3 universities, 2 medical schools. The population there is probably the most literate in the world. There's nowhere where the literacy rate is as high as Gaza. I think maybe 1 or 2 places just beat it. This is a legendary man. He is teaching here. He's a professor of rehabilitation medicine. And you'll see more about him later in the talk. Teaching the students. There he is. He stayed behind in Gaza. And this is him. He refused to leave. This is him. Once again, his worldly goods on his back with another forced evacuation from a hospital. He was working as a doctor in all the hospitals. And those are his worldly goods. That's just us still. We linked with him via WhatsApps during the siege. And he's literally wandering around and living in places like this along with family and supporters. He's been, of course, compared to this person in the Nakba who's carrying the whole of Palestine on his shoulders. The Nakba 1948 was when Israel ethnically cleansed the whole of the Palestinian population. It deported 3/4 of the population, Palestinian population, 3/4. And it shooed them all into Gaza, which is why Gaza is the home of all refugees. It destroyed 530 towns and villages, kicked them all out of there, took them over or razed them to the ground and planted forests on top. That's the Nakba, a great source of ethnic cleansing, probably counts as genocide. Hamis on the right is compared to that. Hey, the women of Gaza, medical students, they want to be surgeons too. Join Nick and I in the greatest club in the world, the surgical club. And so we're out there to train female surgeons as well. There's Jane, she's teaching neonatal resuscitation, that's resuscitation of newborn babies, to this group of students. And there's Enes. Enes is one of Nick's proteges. She's a surgeon and a great person. And you can see the operating laparoscopic surgery going on in this theatre. Nick's going to talk a lot about El Shifa, but you can see, beautiful hospital. We used to come and sit and drink glasses of orange juice and tea breaks with students and each other, hot days. Looks just like a hospital you and I would be delighted to go in and be treated in. Emergency unit. And a bunch of young Palestinians. This anti-litter crowd, they're all trying to clean up Gaza. They've got to clean up Gaza because Gaza's got a plastic bottle issue because Israel drops a rocket into the water purification. Shurik's works just so often to make sure the water is never drinkable in Gaza. So anything comes out of a tap in Gaza is not potable. You have to drink water out of plastic bottles and boil it. And of course, the sea is always polluted. So you can imagine many dozens of aid trucks going every day or dead, just carrying bottled water into Gaza. The plastic bottle issue is tremendous. And these are young activist students. These are just pictures of the various hospitals in Gaza, all built with foreign money and staffed by locals and partnerships with the local Gazans. Lots of them, all gone, all completely gone. This is the IUG campus, fantastic place, very beautiful campus, and you can see it there. And we went there, and this is an event at the end of our trip. And Nick here has been presented with a medallion for his good work and for thanking us for coming and teaching in Gaza. You can see we're all getting a little academic keffiyeh. Here it is. I'll put mine on. It's academic keffiyeh. It says IUG there, and it's got the temple up there, and that's the keffiyeh. I'll keep it on. Oh, someone's got their mic on in the offline. Please turn your mic off. I don't know how we do that, Junaid. And that's what it looks like now. In fact, it looks much worse than that. It was destroyed in 2014 and rebuilt in 5 years to what you saw. This is the 2014 picture. Currently, it's just rubble. Read these for yourself, please. This is the Israeli Defense Minister. We will eliminate everything. Then happy days, getting up early in the morning before work, running along the waterfront. That's 4 of us all jolly happy. Nick's still in bed. And there we are on the deck of the hotel, mocktails, come home for lunch, wonderful things. There's Shemek over there. He's been a great organizer in our lives. Brilliant museums, full of extraordinary old architecture, archaeology, painting, art, stunning places, all completely gone, just destroyed, bombed to smithereens. And this famous picture, this is Bruce and I going for a swim. Mostly the water in Gaza is unswimmable because it's got raw sewage. But at that point in time, someone declared that the E. coli count was low enough for a swim. So anyway, we went and kept our mouths tightly shut and had a great swim in the seas of Gaza. Beautiful place. We went into that mosque, completely destroyed. This is the Great Mosque of Gaza. Extraordinary place. It was built on the site of a Philistine temple, allegedly. That's 800 BC. And it was built by the Byzantines, a Christian church in about the 5th century before the Roman Empire. The Byzantines took over, and it swapped hands, Christian, Muslim through whatever happens. And finally, in World War I, the British Army bombed it, declaring that it was being used as a weapons cache. Sounds a little familiar with the current version, doesn't it? It was rebuilt, spectacular place. You can just feel the spirit. It's a unique mix of Mamluk, Italian, and Arab architecture, and that's it now. Al-Amari Mosque is completely destroyed. And it was within a few weeks of the start of the war. They went straight for it. This is Moses instructing Joshua, and we had Netanyahu imagining that he is in fact Joshua being instructed by Moses. Slay them all. Beautiful markets, and this extraordinary graveyard. You must remember World War I, the Ottoman Turks were siding with the Germans, and the Egyptian Allied Egyptian Expeditionary Force fought 3 battles of Gaza, was smashed by the Turks in the first 2, won the 3rd, thanks to the Arab army and T.E. Lawrence. And this graveyard has about 3,500 to 4,000 Allied graves in it. And it's absolutely beautifully tended. And when we were there, we were introduced to the head gardener, and our hosts translated, and he said that he felt that he was a son of the garden, and he was celebrating 100th anniversary of his great-grandfather starting as head gardener in this beautiful cemetery, 1919 that would have been. And it is maintained with absolute love and dignity. And of course, Israel's come up with the whole story that the Gazans are exhuming the bodies as revenge on the Brits. It's crazy. Hasbara. This is their gorgeous little fishing harbor. But of course, you can't fish very far. Israel stops the ships and boats as soon as they go out more than about 1 kilometer and attacks them and holds them, steals their petrol. So people fish like this. But it's Gaza. Love this picture. And that's having dinner at Ennis's house. Family, look at that hospitality. Incredible food. The hospitality we had was quite extraordinary. But the president of Israel says that all those people in that picture, all the people I've shown you, are all complicit. They must all be killed. So let's finish with the children. Guys, it's all about children. This post is November, 6 weeks after October the 7th. That's me, or you. And these are 6,000 dead children around us. That counts now as 18 or 19,000 dead children. That's just dead children. Every day in Gaza, 10 children's limbs are amputated. That doesn't mean 10 children. Some of them have 2 or 3 limbs amputated at a time. 10 limbs a day. This Mordecai Gadar, very famous pressman, Israeli scholar, who says that he doesn't equate them with animals. The only thing deters them is they know their sister or mother will be raped in the event that they're caught. Banksy has the final word. Thank you. Sorry. Moving on, I want to introduce Nick. Now, there you go. So Nick is our Department of Surgery's Penman Lecturer currently. It's an annual prestigious award to a surgeon from the UK. They come out and we work them to smithereens for 2 weeks teaching and having fun and joining us, and they seem to enjoy it. He's a Prof of Surgery in Oxford, and he took up his appointment there in January 1997. I left in December 1996. We missed by a month, but we knew each other. I was returning to Mandela and Tutu's New South Africa. His expertise is surgery of the esophagus and stomach, i.e. the organs where your food begins its journey to the lower, rather less sexy end of the intestinal tract, where I practiced my surgery, the rectum and the bowels and the anus. He's got a stellar curriculum vitae, reflecting his commitment to serving patients and colleagues on many fronts. He first visited Palestine in 2008. He's been there regularly since, and he takes a group of Oxford hospital consultants to Gaza each year. I get invited as an old boy of the Department of Surgery, and he takes in pediatricians, obs and gynae docs, internal medicine and surgery. He's worked in Gaza. He's worked in Gaza, as assisting Gaza and colleagues to establish surgical cancer services there. And he also works with MAP, Medical Aid Palestine, UK, tremendous organization. In December 2023, okay, just after October, when things were really hot, Nick led the first UK medical mission into Gaza and worked at the Al-Aqsa Hospital for several weeks. He went back a few months later, and he would have been back since, except Israel has made it practically impossible to take medical teams in there. His advocacy includes multiple meetings with politicians in Westminster, Washington, DC, and the United Nations. 10 days ago, Nick was awarded the Humanitarian Medal by the UK government for his humanitarian work in Gaza, and presented with it by His Royal Highness the King Charles at Buckingham Palace. There he is with his wife, Fianula. Nick looking like a good colonial Brit. Jolly proud of the royal family and all that stuff, and we all know how we feel about our colonial, ex-colonial masters, but nevertheless, that's how we prefer to see Nick. Leading a protest outside the John Radcliffe Hospital, because the hospital wouldn't let them protest inside the hospital. So they moved the protest outside the hospital. And that's him and Fanula on the streets of Ireland, protesting. Irish weather, as we can see, never damps a smile. And that's his daughter Sacha and Fanula, and that's their daughter being handcuffed. Gave Nick a bit of scary moments, because she obviously said something she shouldn't have said. But a great family of protesters, and that's a fabulous picture of Fanula with the Irish flag above the Palestinian flag marching down the main street. So that's Nick. This is him about to start a big operation on a very big man in Gaza. And Nick, I'm going to hand over to you, and just with this introduction. This is from the Guardian newspaper in Britain just now. Professor Nick Maynard, a senior surgical consultant at Oxford Hospitals who worked in hospitals in Gaza during the war, said, the arbitrary detention of hundreds of medical staff in Israeli prisons sets a chilling precedent. We've just witnessed a war in which hundreds of medical staff, including some of Gaza's most experienced medical staff, are dragged away from their patients, killed or thrown into prisons for months at a time and tortured with impunity in breach of the Geneva Conventions and other humanitarian laws, he says. It's a deliberate attempt to terrorize, hollow out, and disable an already depleted and traumatized healthcare workforce. It will inevitably lead to the deaths of many, many civilians, said the professor. Nick. Nick couldn't find his kefir, so I'm going to put it on.
I left it at home in Oxford. My wife put it out for me, and of course, I forgot it.
You packed your own suitcase. Bad mistake.
It was a bad mistake.
What you do, then just leave it there. I think it gets.
And I'm going to.
Yeah, so let me do this for you. It won't go away. We've tried, but they don't see it out there. Okay, that's you. And you just,
Yep, Bob. Thank you very much indeed for that very kind introduction, and it's a great honour to be with you tonight. Giving this talk, it's been a fantastic honour being the Penman Fellow, meeting so many wonderful colleagues, healthcare workers from Grooterschuur and other hospitals in Cape Town. So it's not finished yet. Bob said they are, as he said, they are working me very hard, but I'm loving every single second of it. But I'm looking forward to a week of drinking wine and beer in Franschhoek and Paternoster afterwards. So I'm going to talk about Gaza, a war on healthcare. I don't know if any of you saw the World Press Photography Competition. It was in London last summer. And the picture on there's a fantastic exhibition, and the picture on the left won first prize. And that is a picture of a lady holding her dead niece in Gaza City. And the picture on the right was one of the runner-up photos. And that is a picture of a lady walking through Khan Yunis, which is one of the major towns in Gaza, and one that Bob and I know well and have been to on many occasions. It's been destroyed, of course. I'm going to start by just mentioning the CNN quote of the day. Back in March last year, I'd just come back from my first major post-October the 7th trip to Gaza, and I'll shortly going out again. And I was invited out to the States to do some advocacy with a couple of American surgeons who I know well. We went to the United Nations. We went to Washington, D.C. to meet members of the Biden administration. We did a lot of media interviews as well. And one of my colleagues was a chap called Dr. Thea Ahmed, who's an emergency doctor from Chicago. And he was interviewed by CNN. And the interviewer said, "What's it like in Gaza then?" And his quote was the CNN quote of the day and really went viral around social media. And his answer was, "It was apocalyptic, it was horrific, it was miserable." And it was indeed apocalyptic, horrific and miserable. And it's been like that for 15 months. And it continues to be like that. And of course, we welcome the ceasefire. But there is still genocide being perpetrated on the inhabitants of Gaza. There's so many people dying. And of course, the West Bank, there are people being killed as well. This is a humanitarian talk. I'm not talking about politics, but you can't divorce the politics about it. And every now and again during this talk, I will dispel a couple of myths that are out there in the media. And during the last 15 months, we've seen what I believe to be the very, very worst of humanity when you see what's happened to the Gazans. But you've also seen some examples of the very, very best of humanity. And Bob showed this picture of Hamis. He's my closest friend in Gaza. I've known him since 2010. And that is him sitting there at a meeting. You can actually see my right shoulder next to him. And when I first met Hamis in 2010, he took me to this hospital that he ran, the Al Wafa Rehabilitation Hospital in eastern Gaza. It was a wonderful place. It was neuro rehabilitation for people with severe hypoxic brain injuries or spinal cord injuries, predominantly, but not exclusively, from war trauma. And it was a beautiful oasis of peace within Gaza. And this hospital was destroyed, was bombed in 2014. So 10 years ago. So they've been destroying, the Israeli Air Force have been destroying hospitals for well over a decade. And this is back in 2015. I was meant to go out to Gaza when that war was going on. Clearly couldn't go, but I went in about 2 months later. And this is Hamis. I'm taking the photograph, showing me where his office had been in that hospital, and it had been completely destroyed. You've seen the picture on the bottom right. That's on the top right is Hamis in July of last year, searching for food at 5 o'clock in the morning with his son. At one point, Hamis and his family were living on animal feed and nothing else to eat. Like many people in Gaza City and Jabalia, they were living on animal feed. They had no proper food at all for many weeks. And that is a photograph Bob and I both got sent in our Oxford Gaza WhatsApp group this morning. Tanya is a wonderful friend of ours. She came out to the West Bank with me when she was a medical student, has been back to Gaza many times. She's in there today. That was a photograph she took of Hamis yesterday. She's in with the current MAP team, and she managed to meet up with him. So there are many challenges to providing healthcare in normal Gaza. And I say normal Gaza because this is what the Gazans are used to pre-October the 7th. It's what people like Bob and me are used to. And we call it normal Gaza, but of course it's not remotely normal by any other stretch of the imagination. There's something. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the problems with healthcare prior to October the 7th, all of which have been profoundly magnified since then. And before I talk about some of the challenges, it's important to remember in the WHO definition of health of a nation, an essential core requirement for a healthy nation is human security. And of course, that's been missing in Gaza for many, many years, and to a lesser degree, but significantly so in the West Bank as well. So there are social determinants of poor health. The borders are permanently closed, and the economy has been almost completely disabled by Israeli control. And again, just to remind you, we're talking about pre-October the 7th in normal Gaza. Extreme poverty and unemployment, permanent food and water insecurity, much, much worse now, but that existed before October the 7th. Poor sanitation, inability to travel, and that means that 99% plus of Gazan civilians have never, ever been allowed to leave their country. It's been variously described as a large prison or concentration camp, and indeed it is. Most people, 99% plus, have never been able to leave their country. And there are continuing energy and fuel insecurity and power cuts to the extent that Bob and I and others on our trips would often have electricity only for 2 or 3 hours in the day. And if you didn't have a generator, at night it was dark. There are medical problems. There's a chronic shortage of drugs, medicines and disposables. Again, much, much worse now for obvious reasons. Malnutrition existed. I'm going to talk later in my talk about the problems with malnutrition now and how the policy of starvation has been killing people, but it existed there before. Inadequate capacity, both in terms of staff and infrastructure, outdated medical equipment, denials of treatment referrals. What that means is that you can't treat everything in Gaza. So as an example, there are no linear accelerators. You cannot give radiotherapy in Gaza. So if someone needs radiotherapy, you need to apply to take them out, usually to East Jerusalem, to Al-Maqasad Hospital, occasionally to Jordan, occasionally to Egypt, even rarely, but definitely occasionally into Israel. But to apply for that, you've got to go through a long bureaucratic process. 1 in 3 of them are turned down. So only 2 out of 3 accepted. Often 2 or 3 months it takes to get that approval, by which time the cancer will have grown, perhaps to incurability. And even if you're granted a permission to go out, 2/3 of those people who go out are not allowed any companions at all. And that means the 3-year-old child going for radiotherapy for their brain tumor is sent out alone, without their parents, without any members of the family. And of course, there's a lack of specialists getting out and coming in. I don't know what's happening here, sorry. Yeah. So this is one of the trips. This is, I think, the trip that Bob was on, 2019. You can see him looking very young on the back right there. It is a wonderful, wonderful week we've had every year out there for many years. We have great fun. We work very hard, and you can see everyone's smiling there. The main thrust of the trip for many years has been the morning sessions on the wards. We spend every morning on the wards doing bedside teaching basic clinical skills, how to examine patients, how to take histories, a bit of seminar-based teaching as well. And as Bob said, surgeons, physicians, paediatricians, obstetricians, this is me demonstrating the importance of observation before you put your grubby hands on the patient. In the afternoon, we spend time at the Islamic University of Gaza Medical School. We do a whole load of clinical scenario OSCE-style stations. This is one of the medical school workers dressed up as a trauma victim, and we're doing an ATLS station to resuscitate and treat a bomb victim. And we put them through the drill, we time it and everything, and it's very, very effective. This is Debbie Harrington, a great friend of ours who teaches. She's an obstetrician in Oxford. She was actually part of the emergency medical team that I went in with in December last year, and she's teaching here on an obstetric trauma model. This is Andrew Wilkinson teaching on a neonatal resuscitation station. This is me teaching on the infamous laparoscopic polo mint competition. This was a very old, defunct laparoscopic skills box I nicked from the Nuffield Department of Surgery in Oxford because they weren't using it anymore. And we had a competition where you had to transfer polos from one side to the other in a fixed amount of time, and it generated huge competition. So as Bob said, I've also been going out concurrent with that. And I should add that we were about to go out. I think Bob had actually bought his flight tickets to go out in November 2023 to do our annual teaching reach. And of course, that was cancelled. Separate to this, I've been going out with Medical Aid for Palestinians, which is a wonderful charity in the UK. It has been taking missions, groups of doctors out to Gaza for many years to help work with them to improve their healthcare system. And the philosophy of MAP is not like some NGOs, which is to go in and do a very big operation and then leave again, because then you're really helping one patient, aren't you? The MAP philosophy is very much about transference of skills, teaching them to develop these services so you're no longer necessary. And that's what I've been doing with particularly upper GI cancer surgery and complex upper GI laparoscopic surgery. I was advising more generally about developing their upper GI cancer services, and they really had made huge strides forward, particularly embracing the concept of subspecialization, the need for that, and centralization of cancer service. They'd actually built a standalone cancer hospital, a Turkish hospital, which was devoted entirely to cancer treatment, but of course it's now been destroyed. And they were embracing the concept of multidisciplinary team working, and they'd set up MDTs in colorectal surgery. We had our first online MDT set up and arranged for October the 14th, 2023. We had our flights booked to fly out on October the 21st to do a week of gastric cancer surgery on patients we'd decided in that MDT, and of course that was all cancelled. And that's me. You've seen the picture on the right. I think I am looking there. So what on earth have I agreed to do this case for? And they presented this very large patient, and I realized they had no fixed retraction systems at all. So I had to rely upon medical students retracting, no energy devices whatsoever. And I had to demonstrate how to do a very radical D2 gastrectomy. It went all right. And on the left, another one of these utterly inspirational people you meet in Gaza, Sarah Al-Saka, who Bob will remember very well, a female consultant surgeon at Shifa Hospital who was heroic. Heroic doesn't actually do it justice. She was quite remarkable in the first few months of the war. We were in touch with her several times a week. She was the first female surgeon ever to train and qualify as a surgeon in Gaza. And you can imagine the difficulties she faced going through those training years as the only female doing it. A remarkable young lady. So that was normal Gaza, a beautiful country, but a very, very challenging place to work and to provide decent healthcare. So then, of course, the appalling events of October the 7th, 2023, and of course, the destruction of Gaza since then has changed it, I fear, irreparably. And certainly to get it back to anywhere the way it was will take many, many years of rebuilding. So I'm not going to give you lots of facts and figures, but I'm going to give you a few. This is from the UN OCHA website, which is updated weekly, telling us about the fatalities there. And this is from last week, the 18th, and day 502 since October the 7th. And according to the UN data, which is derived from the Ministry of Health in Gaza, there have been 48,291 deaths from trauma. Now, I'm going to come back to that figure later because we know that figure is a gross underestimate. It doesn't include all the thousands of people who remain buried under the rubble. And of course, it doesn't include all the excess deaths from non-trauma related diseases. So I will come back to that. But I'm going to talk predominantly about the destruction of the healthcare system and the deliberate targeting of doctors and other healthcare workers. There's been over 1,000 healthcare workers have been killed, more than 350 healthcare workers abducted and tortured. And I'm going to give you some of the testimonies that I've taken from individuals who have been tortured out there. Multiple hospitals deliberately targeted. There are no fully functioning hospitals in Gaza anymore. They say in the United Nations report that 18 hospitals are currently partly functioning, but a partly functioning hospital in Gaza may mean no more than the ability to do field dressings. So there are very, very few hospitals. And I'm going to show you some of my experiences in Al-Aqsa Hospital, but very few hospitals that can function remotely normally. There are more than 1 million children who are in urgent need of mental health and psychosocial support. Nearly 20,000 children now who are unaccompanied, either because their parents have been killed, and we saw many, many orphans, or they've been separated from their parents because of the multiple displacements. More than 12,000 at the last counting, awaiting urgent medical evacuation for life-saving treatment that cannot be provided in Gaza, and more than 1 million people with significant acute infectious illnesses. So let's talk a bit about the children again. Bob showed us that horrific picture of the dead children there. This graph on the left was published in November 2023, when the killing rate of children was at its highest. At that time, there were 136 children being killed every day in Gaza. I've worked out that that's come down, but the median number of children that's been killed every single day in Gaza over the 15 months is over 40 children per day. Now, in the other war going on in the world, which is Ukraine, the tragic war going over there, that equivalent number in Ukraine is 0.7. In the Iraq war, it was 0.6. In Syria, 3. In Afghanistan, 2. Ukraine, 0.7. Gaza, more than 40 children per day have been killed. There's an acronym that we all use in Gaza. I used on multiple occasions, which is WCNSF, a label we had to give to children. That stands for Wounded Child, No Surviving Family. So many children brought in, often severely injured, but orphaned because their parents have been killed. And more children have been killed in Gaza in the last 15 months than in all the conflicts of the world put together over the last 5 years. Just think about that fact. So let me tell you about my Sarah. So my Sarah, this is in my kitchen in Oxford. You can see Fanula there, my son who's an anaesthetist, my son who runs a restaurant. My daughter's not in this picture. Enas, who you saw a picture of earlier, is on the back left. And next to her is my Sarah, who was a medical student I taught in Gaza in about 2016 at Al-Azhar University, the other medical school in Gaza. He, like Enas, got a Chevening scholarship to come out of Gaza to study at King's. Enas went to Leeds, and my Sarah went to King's in London and did a master's. He then went back to Gaza. Enas stayed and has become a member of our family, really. But my Sarah went back, and he went to work for Médecins du Monde, an NGO, French NGO in Gaza, utilising his skills as a doctor. And on November the 8th, 2023, he was killed. He became a great friend of our family. He spent many days with us, weekends with us when he was in England, and my kids got to know him very well. He was killed. He had just got married a few months previously. his two brothers and his wife had popped out to the shops, and he was in the house with his parents and his sisters, and an Israeli jet given to them by the United States using bombs which had been partly provided by my government in the United Kingdom, and an F-16 jet bombed the house and killed my Sarah and his parents and his sisters. His two brothers came back and spent the next 48 hours searching through the rubble. 48 hours non-stop searching through the rubble, looking for the dead bodies of their close ones. And after 48 hours of non-stop searching, another F-16 jet bombed them and killed them, leaving my Sarah's wife as the sole remaining member of that family. On the right side of that picture, I should have said on the bottom right, is Fanula with my Sarah Ninas when he got his master's degree. But on the top is Khaled, who is another one of these profoundly inspirational people. He's a local Gazan. He works for MAP in Gaza. They have a wonderful team on the ground in Gaza. And he looked after me every single day in my trips there post October the 7th. He put his life on the line every single day, looking after people like me. And he was my Sarah's best friend. And I was sitting talking to him last May in Gaza, and he was telling me about the last conversation he had with my Sarah, which was a week before my Sarah was killed. And my Sarah was sitting down telling him that he wasn't frightened about dying. And indeed, he expected to be martyred. He expected to be killed. And I've heard that from many, many people in Gaza. They expect to be killed by the Israelis, and they're not frightened about being killed. But what frightened my Sarah, what kept him awake at night, was the idea of being bombed and being left buried under the rubble and being denied a proper burial. So we're now 15 months after he was killed, and my Sarah is still buried under the rubble. His body has not been discovered, and he's still being denied a proper burial. And there are, of course, many, many thousands of my Sarahs still there, buried under the rubble. So I was working at Al-Aqsa Hospital. It's a small hospital. It normally has about 150 patients. There were 850 patients in the hospital when I was there. So the vast majority of patients were lying on the ground. We treated most of our patients on the ground, putting chest drains into children on the ground of the ER because there were no beds to put them on. And we spent, this is with Khaled Dawas, who's a great, great friend of mine, who is a surgeon in London. He's actually Gazan. He was my registrar many years ago, he's become a great friend. And he and I went out there together and have been out to Gaza a lot together. And we spent all day for the first trip we were out there for weeks doing major trauma laparotomies and thoracotomies. I work in Oxford. The last penetrating trauma I saw in Oxford was about 6 years ago when someone was stabbed with an avocado knife. So we don't see much trauma. You guys see far, far more than me. But we saw a huge amount of bomb injury trauma with shrapnels. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the weapons they use, the bombs they use. The worst ones were these fragmentation missiles, which fragment into thousands of pieces of very small metal. And I'd never seen shrapnel damage before, but believe me, shrapnel damage, it is quite appalling the damage it can do. So we spent all our time doing, and most people near the bombs are killed, of course. These are people who might have been 50 to 100 meters away who survive. And we spent all our time doing that. And this was the appearance of a typical operating theatre. Every day it looked like this. They come in extremis in their clothes are dumped on the ground, there's blood everywhere. You normally don't see the shrapnel. Normally the shrapnel is very, very small, and you often don't see it. This one was a bit bigger. You can see in this picture on the bottom left, on the table, as the several feet of bowel are removed, but there's a lump there of wood. It's about 4 centimeters wide. That had gone through the right chest, through the right lung, through the diaphragm, through the liver, through the duodenum, hitting the head of the pancreas, into the small bowel and into the colon, causing appalling damage. So that was the patient was, we saved his life, but again, appalling internal damage to his chest and his abdomen. This was a typical day in Al-Aqsa emergency room. It's a very small hospital. It's not a trauma hospital. And we'd go down there when there were mass casualties being brought in. You'll all be familiar with the concept of triage. Well, triage collapses in situations like this when you get multiple dozens of people being brought in, many of them just dumped outside because they're dead, but dozens of people coming in with major life-threatening injuries, 3-year-old children missing 1, 2, 3 limbs sometimes, terrible burns. You can't triage those. So it's a lottery as to who gets treated. And there's a saying, it's well known out there, that if someone comes in with a family member or a friend shouting for them, they're more likely to get treated. And they literally come in, they scream and shout, they get hold of, they drag you over to treat their loved ones. If you come in by yourself, you get dumped on the floor and you often don't get treated. So this is what it looked like most days in the emergency room. And I'm going to tell you about one particular afternoon that I was there. I'd been operating in the morning with Khaled, and we went down to the ER between operations because we knew there'd been another mass of casualties coming in. And the first thing I saw when I walked in there was complete chaos, no triage possible at all. I saw a little boy who'd been abandoned. He was lying on the ground in the waiting area. No one had seen him. No one had triaged him, and he was in extremis, terrible burns. And the first thing I saw was a large hole in the right side of his chest. And you could see air being sucked in to that. And he was moribund. I picked him up. We went into the resuscitation room, which is the picture you see there. And you can see me at the top of that picture. We're putting a chest drain into the 6-year-old boy. There was only one trolley in that resuscitation room, and the child with the bandage on his head that you can see there was lying on that trolley. He'd been admitted 2 hours previously from another bomb. He had been brought in with a non-survivable head injury. His brain was exposed. There was no chance of survival, so we just wrapped his head up, and he was dying, but he hadn't died. He was breathing still, but dying a slow death. We had to pick him up, put him on the ground in the corner of the resuscitation room so he could die there while we treated that little boy. In the bottom of that picture is Aya, who turned out to be the sister of Allah, the little boy, and she was 8, and she didn't have critical injuries, but she had a very badly broken leg. And that leg was so badly displaced that she'd lost the pulses in her foot. So to the non-medics, that means there was no blood getting beyond the fracture. So we had to straighten her leg in order to preserve the blood supply. And this was a day like most days in Al-Aqsa Hospital, where we had completely run out of all pain relief. We had no morphine, no strong painkillers at all. So a young orthopedic surgeon had to straighten that girl's leg with no pain relief at all. And I can still hear the appalling screams from her as that leg was straightened. I went back to theatre then, and Debbie, my great friend and colleague, stayed down in the ER. And she told me about a patient that came in 3 hours later, another set of mass casualties. And an 8-year-old girl came in with burns that were so bad, the facial burns so bad that you could see her facial bones through the burnt flesh. And she wasn't going to survive those. She wouldn't have survived those injuries in Cape Town or in Oxford or in London. She certainly wasn't going to survive them in Gaza. So all you could do was try and palliate her to let her die peacefully. But of course, we had no pain relief. So this young girl of 8 died an agonizing death over 3 or 4 hours, lying on the floor of the waiting area of the ER because there was nowhere private for her to go, and no pain relief at all. So the healthcare system has been completely disabled in Gaza. There's been no electricity since October the 7th. And if the hospital runs out of fuel for its generator, then there is no power in that hospital. That means there's no lights. And my friends, I didn't have to do this, friends of mine had to operate using a mobile phone light sometimes. If there's no fuel for the generator, then you can't keep ventilators going. So patients on a ventilator will die. If there's no fuel for the generator, then you can't use incubators. So babies in incubators die. And many of you may have heard about that awful, awful tale of Al Nasser Hospital, the paediatric hospital in Gaza City, which had been taken over by the Israeli ground forces and all the staff evacuated, and they'd left 6 babies in incubators. And they left after 3 weeks, and the staff went back in there and found those 6 babies rotting in the incubators. And there are many, many examples of that. No drugs, no painkillers, no blood products sometimes running out of surgical gloves. You have to wash your surgical gloves between operations. For my last trip out there, we didn't have any sterile drapes ever for any of our operations. We had to make them up to try and create a sterile field. Not surprisingly, everyone gets terrible infections. As I said, triage has collapsed. The doctors and nurses, we were there working for a few weeks at a time non-stop. They've been working there for 15, 16 months without a break, some of them, and often not knowing if their families were dead or alive in their camps. So many, many thousands in Al-Aqsa Hospital, normally 150 patients in there. We had 850 patients, and in the grounds of the hospital, there were probably about 15,000 people who'd all been displaced. I don't know if any of you seen that documentary recently that was briefly put up on the BBC. And I thought, God, at long last, the BBC have behaved themselves, and they've taken it down again. Surviving a war zone. So Bob's got the link, I've got the link as well. So one of the stars of that is Zeki. He's called Zakari, but we called him Zeki in that right-hand picture. He's an 8-year-old boy who worked with us every day when we were there in this hospital for all the weeks we were there. He would help us take patients to theatres. He used to go out with the paramedics to the bomb zones, bomb sites, and bring patients back. One of his jobs was to take dead bodies to the morgue as well, or to the makeshift morgue because the morgue was filled. Just imagine what the future holds for someone like that. So this is Al-Shifa Hospital. You saw this picture earlier. A beautiful, iconic hospital. It's older than the State of Israel. It was built in 1947. The major trauma center, the major hospital in Gaza, a place that I've worked in for many, many years and know many of the staff there. These are pictures that Bob and I got on our WhatsApp group this morning from Tanya. She was there yesterday. This is what it's like now, completely and utterly destroyed. But they're now treating patients again in there, remarkably. And when the Israeli ground force left Shifa Hospital in April, the end of April, beginning of May, in fact it was, there were 300 dead bodies discovered of Palestinian civilians who'd been killed. And these weren't Hamas militants. Many of them were children, many of them were women, many of them were patients there. Most of them had been shot, executed, and most of them had their hands handcuffed behind their back, including people that I knew and had worked with there. So the targeting the hospitals is not just bombing the hospitals, it's systematically destroying the laboratories, going in and destroying the machines that do blood tests. It's going in and destroying every single dialysis machine in Shifa Hospital. It's taking out the water tank, so there's no water supply, the sewage facilities, each CT scanner, each MRI scanner. And this is a young plastic surgeon who I knew. I didn't know him well, but I'd worked with him when I was there in May 2023, Dr. Ahmad Makadma. And that's his mother, who was the consultant physician in Shifa Hospital. They were both executed. They were both discovered by friends of mine, the chief of surgery there, Marwan. He discovered them with his friends. They both had bullet wounds in the head, and they both had their hands handcuffed behind their back. So I'm going to talk a bit about the detention and torture. I should have said at the beginning of this talk, everything I'm telling you is what I have witnessed with my own eyes, or people I've known for many years have witnessed and have told me, people I would trust implicitly. So these are 2 people I interviewed. I took very detailed audio and video test minutes from them, and they've been used in the international courts, or they will be used. They've been submitted to the international courts and will be used. On the left is Sari, who's an operating theatre nurse. He was at the Indonesian hospital. On the right is Haitam. He didn't want his face to be shown. He was a young doctor working at Nasser Hospital. They were both kidnapped abducted, illegally detained for about 60 days each from different hospitals, but they tell very similar stories. So I'll condense it into one story. They were both incarcerated for about 60 days. They were stripped naked, they were blindfolded, they were handcuffed with their hands behind their back. For the whole 60 days, they were not allowed to lie down. They were kept sitting down or on their knees. They were beaten every single day, sometimes for 12 hours non-stop. They both had dogs set on them whilst handcuffed and immobilized. They both electrocuted, they were burned. They had the most appalling torture put on them, and including a lot of mental torture as well. You may know the name Dr. Adnan Al-Bursh, who was an iconic, very well-known orthopedic surgeon there. I've met him several times. He was abducted, he was detained in an Israeli prison, and he was killed after many weeks of torture. And this is a quote from him on the left, before he'd actually been kidnapped, but whilst knowing that many doctors had been kidnapped. Practicing medicine in Gaza has become a crime, and the penalty for saving people's lives has become detention and being tortured to death. So he was killed, and a very commendable, I've been very unimpressed with Western media, but there are some exceptions. This is a Sky journalist who actually investigated in great detail the mechanisms of Adnan al-Bursh killing in this Israeli prison. And he interviewed many people who had been in prison with them. And this orthopedic surgeon, this iconic surgeon, was serially raped to death over a period of 3 weeks and died as a result of serial daily rapings. That's what's happening to some of these people. And there's a document which has been, it's in the public domain, you can get it. It's called The Killing, Detention and Torture of Healthcare Workers in Gaza by Healthcare Workers Watch. The article that Bob talked about has been in The Guardian, described this, and it's been put together by two very close friends, Tanya, who you saw in that video, and Bex, both of whom have been out to Gaza many times with us. And they've liaised with two Gazan doctors we know and have provided very, very detailed testimonies on many hundreds of people who've been killed or tortured in Israeli prisons. And I'm not going to read that list out. These are all methods of torture that have been used, and there has been documented and evidenced methods of torture being used on Gazan civilians who've been detained illegally. As I said before, there's well over 1,000 healthcare workers killed. They talk about this in great detail. 33% are women, and there's been nearly 300 cases of unlawful detention of healthcare workers. And they describe in this very, very clear patterns of conduct by the Israeli authorities and military, the systematic torture and abuse of Palestinian detainees, sometimes being killed, very, very clear evidence of deliberate infliction of violent injuries on male detainees' external genitalia, particularly evil in my view, the connivance of Israeli healthcare workers in the medical neglect, the medical negligence, the ill treatment and the torturing of Palestinian civilians, and a specific clear targeting of very senior healthcare workers in Gaza, with a clear intent of many of us that believe to undermine yet further the possibility of giving any healthcare to future Gazan civilians. So there are novel battle-tested weapons being used in Gaza, many of us suspect with the full knowledge of the US military. So on the right is a picture of a quadcopter. This is a drone with 4 fixed rotors that allow it to hover. And they have cameras attached to them, remotely controlled by presumably someone in Israel, camera on them and guns loaded on them as well. And they are flown, and I've seen patients who've been shot with these. A friend of mine was shot with one of these. They're flown into hospitals, into operating theatres, and then they shoot healthcare workers or they shoot patients. A friend of mine was shot by one of those. He survived. There are many examples, and we saw victims of these. They have dogs who, and Sari, that nurse who I interviewed, gave me a very detailed description of dogs who've been trained, who go into the hospitals with cameras attached to their backs and guns attached to their backs, and then remotely controlled to shoot healthcare workers. Chemical weapons, I didn't see any evidence of white phosphorus burns, but many of my colleagues did, these terrible white phosphorus burns. Vaporizing missiles, I talked about the fragmentation missiles, and I didn't see these, but missiles with retractable blades, which are particularly damaging for amputating limbs, and a lot of evidence of artificial intelligence being used for the targeting. There is a deconfliction process that's meant to protect healthcare workers from abroad going in there. And every day one of our colleagues for MAP, a MAP Gazan colleague, would contact COGAT, which is the liaison branch of the Israeli army, to check that where we were was safe, the hospitals we were working in, if we were living in a safe house, the roads we were traveling in, to make sure they were safe. And we were told repeatedly, yes, it's safe. So we went to work in Al-Aqsa Hospital. This is a big hole in the wall of the intensive care unit, and I was operating in the operating theatre next door to this when there was an Israeli missile attack on the intensive care unit of the hospital. We'd been told earlier that day it was deconflicted. It clearly wasn't. We had to evacuate then. There was an MSF team, they evacuated, and we knew that no longer was that hospital safe for us to work in. This is the house in my first trip over there, Christmas and New Year in December and January. This was the house we lived in, a safe house, or we thought it was safe, in Al Mawasi. You've heard about that. It's meant to be the safe zone. The Israelis have been continually telling us it's a safe area. That was, but when we'd left Gaza, another UK team came in. They were in that house at 6 in the morning when it was bombed by an Israeli jet. No one killed, luckily, but they all sustained shrapnel damage. I went and met Lord Cameron, our then Foreign Secretary, to talk about this when I got back. And he said he'd been in touch with the Israeli government and they had apologized, which was very nice of them. They'd apologized and said it was a mistake, that it was collateral damage because they'd been aiming for the building next door. The reason we chose this house was because it was 250 meters away from the nearest building. So, of course, they were lying. This is what Gaza looks like now. That's Al Mawasi on the coast with tents. Those are detainees being herded up. And on the bottom right, you can see dead bodies being put into a makeshift grave. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about malnutrition before I finish. So there is no doubt there is a famine in northern Gaza. And we know that not only have the United Nations stated that starvation is used as a method of war, though that is the first main charge that the ICC has laid at Netanyahu and Gallant for their charges of genocide. The starvation is being used as a method of war. And the malnutrition problems are terrible. And of course, it's not just about losing weight. We saw the effects of malnutrition on surgical patients trying to recover from bomb blast injuries. And of course, they get immunosuppressed, poor tissue healing, everything breaks down. We defunction with stomas, everything we possibly can, but you can't defunction everything. They all break down, they get terrible infections, they have they become profoundly catabolic. And of course, we had no nutrition. We couldn't give them TPN. We had very, very limited stores of enteral nutrition. So they became more and more malnourished, and many of them died. This is one of the abdomens we had to deal with. This had been treated in a field hospital. He came to us like this, multiple fistulae, they'd put lots of tubes into the bowel. On the hole on the right side of the abdomen there had been the original entry site from the shrapnel. It had been about 2 centimeters, but it had gradually got bigger. That's his liver, you can see there. It's inconceivable that this patient is going to get better unless he's medically evacuated. Let me tell you about these two young ladies. Lama is pictured here with her permission. I took the photograph with her parents' permission. I've been allowed to use it in my talks because she died. Tala was another girl. I didn't have a photograph of them. Similar stories. Tala was 16, Lama was 18. They both had shrapnel injuries to their abdomen. They both had very significant intestinal damage. And they both required emergency surgery to repair that. There were proximal bowel injuries. We resected some, but they both had injuries which were actually quite straightforward to deal with. And they both had injuries that if they had been well nourished, they very, very likely would have survived. But they both came in profoundly malnourished from northern Gaza. You can see how edematous Lama is there. You can see her stoma that we gave her. That was the shrapnel entry site just above that. She had liquid feces pouring out of that. She had liquid feces, duodenal contents pouring out of her wound. Everything broke down. And she died under my care, as indeed did Tala, and they effectively died of malnutrition. This is Youssef. That's the sort of abdomen we sometimes, he had multiple intracutaneous fistulae. We had no sophisticated wound management systems. Managing these was almost impossible. He was actually medically evacuated to Egypt the day before the Rafah crossing was closed. So he's one of the very last to be evacuated. And I have heard he's doing well in Cairo. But again, we ran out of stoma bags frequently. We had no sophisticated wound management systems. So I'll come back to this figure. This was a publication in The Lancet a few weeks ago. That figure of 48,471 figures. They've applied something called a capture-recapture analysis. I'm not sure I entirely understand it, but they estimate with some degree of accuracy that that figure is an underestimate, and there's probably been about 65,000 people killed directly by the war, by the military assault. And they published back in July this estimation of excess deaths. You know, we became very familiar with that term, didn't we, in COVID? Those not dying of trauma, but dying of cancer or kidney failure or pneumonia or a heart attack or strokes or whatever, diabetes. A lot of them died of diabetes because they ran out of insulin. And they reckon then there was 186,000 people have been killed excess deaths. If you apply that capture-recapture analysis to this, they think in a more recent publication that there's over 200,000 people who've been killed as a direct result of the war. That's 10% of the population of Gaza. And this was in the Lancet just the other day. The life expectancy of Gazans now has fallen by 30 years over the last year. And this excludes, that's based just on trauma-related deaths. This doesn't include all the excess deaths. So it's almost certainly a gross underestimate. Look at that frightening curve there. So we know the children have been targeted. Look at this, a quote from UNICEF: Gaza has become a graveyard for thousands of children. The war in Gaza, the war against children. And I think that Gaza has been failed by the world. It's been failed by governments, and I say that noticing that your government has been, from my perspective, magnificent in what it's done. I know you've all told me they haven't done enough, but believe me, they've done a hell of a lot more than my government. So I think you should be very, very proud of what your country has done so far to help Gaza. It's been failed by the media. Look at that thing on the right there. IDF says it's entered Gaza's Al-Shifa hospital in a targeted operation against Hamas. No truth in that whatsoever. But look about when the Russians invaded the Kiev hospital. Look at the way they described that. I think our academic, and I'm talking about the UK, our academic and medical institutions, the BMA, the GMC, the Royal Colleges, the universities, the hospital trusts, they've all failed Gaza. They've all been silent. At the very best, they've been silent. And whether we're individual society, whether we're universities, medical schools, we will all be defined by how we react to events in Gaza. Hind Rajab, you'll remember that story, won't you? When the BBC reported this, she was found dead in Gaza, but the Ukraine baby was killed by a Russian strike. And this is the BBC. I'm talking a lot about the BBC because I think they've been crap, really. This is the cumulative death toll, killing toll of Palestinian deaths compared to Israeli deaths. And yet look how the numbers, the mentions of Israeli and Palestinian deaths mirror each other almost identically in the BBC. The one exception to that was the time of the Central Kitchen convoy, when there were Gazan deaths, but there were also quite a few non-Gaza deaths as well. So the BBC did report that. I'm going to go on to this one because it's probably a more important slide. So those of us been in Gaza from the UK have written to our politicians. In fact, I will show that because we wrote to these, recognise them? Rishi Sunak, David Cameron. I met David Cameron and his counterpart, Andrew Mitchell. David Lammy and Keir Starmer, we've tried to meet, and they've refused to meet up with us. But 30 of us wrote an open letter to them, telling them what we'd seen. When I went to see David Cameron, I showed them enlarged, coloured, laminated photographs of dead children, of children missing their arms and legs, and saying, this is what's happening. This is what our bombs are doing. Didn't make any difference. And we all stated that we'd all been seen, we'd all treated children, every single one of us, with gunshot wounds to the head or to the chest. Those aren't collateral damage at all. They are deliberate targeting of children. And this is a similar letter from American physicians. Look at this quote here. Gaza was the first time I held the baby's brains in my hand, the first of many. And they said that every single one of them had seen almost daily, some of them, pre-T children coming in with bullets in their head or bullets in their chest or bullets in their abdomen. Again, they're not collateral damage. They are deliberate targeting of children. So I'm not an international lawyer, but every definition of genocide I've ever read has been fulfilled by the events I've witnessed personally in Gaza, with direct targeting of healthcare facilities, direct targeting, abduction, torture, and the killing of healthcare workers, and a complete destruction, not only of the healthcare system, but actually the whole way of life in Gaza. The educational system, the mosques, as Bob showed, the agricultural system, the sewage disposal system, the desalination plants, everything has been destroyed there. So everyone can do something. That's that lovely photograph of my wife, as Bob said. What you didn't say, of course, was that actually soon after that she walked past the Irish embassy. Now, my wife's Irish. As you know, we've left Europe because we've made some silly decisions in our country. My children have all got Irish passports. My dogs have got Irish passports, but I can't get one. So my wife, shortly after that, with the Irish and the Palestinians, went up to the intercom on the Irish embassy and said, give my husband a passport. But I haven't got it yet. And this is, I'm going to finish up by just showing that at the bottom right. This was a picture I took in Al-Aqsa Hospital on something like May the 3rd last year. And this was when the student protests were really, really strong. And Columbia University, New York, was particularly. The many, many children living in the grounds of the hospital, many of them orphans, decided off their own bat to hold a vigil for the students of the world who had been holding vigils for them. A deeply, deeply moving occasion. Don't forget the students. You perform very well here. Look at these are the world medical students, second only to Pakistan in the number of medical students. And I know Bob has done a magnificent job in facilitating that. We, of course, have been absolute rubbish. You can see there. This is Tarek, who's one of the few students who's come over. We still haven't got him affiliated to the university, but we've managed to get him an observer contract with our trust, and he then works on our firms. I'd just like to literally finish, because I have gone longer than I thought. The Gaza Mental Health Centre for Children. Bob, I don't know if you remember going to visit these people. This is another close friend. I'm there next to him, Mohammed Al-Sharif. He's a psychologist. He runs this mental health centre for children in Gaza. And I've known him for years. And since October the 7th, 2023, he spent every single day in Jabalia, despite being displaced on many occasions, every single day supporting the mental health of children, going out into the ruins and trying to help the children, until Christmas Eve, when he was abducted by the Israeli military, and he remains in an Israeli prison. We don't know whether he's alive. We don't know whether he's being tortured. His sister, who is standing next to him there, messages me twice a week, keeps me up to date. And this is a video she sent me the other day. They've just gone back post ceasefire. This is her house, which I'd been to. This is their house. She's gone back to have a look at it. This is how their homes have been so completely destroyed since October the 7th. I'm going to leave it there. I apologise, I've gone over slightly my time, but that's it. Those are the two charities that are magnificent, IMET and MAP. Thank you very much indeed.
So we are going to have a sort of a facilitated discussion is what it's called. Let's see if we can go to my slides again. Yeah. Yeah, we will.
I think sorted that. Can I maybe just give some questions from the fund line?
Sure. Sure. Yeah, do.
So one of the questions is how would suppose it ceasefire impact healthcare? In Gaza?
It's making a small difference, but not a big difference. So there is more aid going in, but it's nothing like enough. The MAP team that I showed you earlier has been allowed into the north of Gaza for the first time. So there've been virtually no NGOs going into the north. So it's making a difference, but it's a very small difference. But just to give you an example of how obstructive the Israelis still are, MAP is keen to take in predominantly orthopedic surgeons, vascular surgeons, and plastic surgeons, because that's what they need the most. They don't really need the sort of skills that I can provide in terms of general surgical, because they've got local surgeons who can do that. But the Israeli government has denied entry to every single orthopedic and plastic surgeon who tried to go in the last since ceasefire, and that is, the absolute truth. So they are still profoundly obstructive. So yes, it's improved, but nothing like enough. And of course, none of us, we can be cynical or we can just hope. But I mean, I certainly won't hold my breath waiting for the ceasefire to last.
Like we had 60 or 80 online. I don't know whether we still have. Am I able to get any slides up? How many? Well, 120. Sure. Can we? Can I show my slides? Oh.
An Israeli ophthalmologist who was about to speak at one of the congresses. We all rallied against it, and in the end, he was disinvited and not to be invited. So I was just wondering what your experience is with sort of academic and boycott or distraction.
So many of you will know there was a letter written by a group of Israeli doctors supporting the mass killing of Gazan civilians. I visited the BMA in London and met up with senior council members to try and persuade them to dissociate themselves, and of course they didn't do this. An example of weakness of our institutions. I've given you the evidence. There's a lot of evidence about their complicity with the torture in prisons. There have been individual examples of Israeli doctors who have been appalled by by what's happened, but I think they're in a very small minority. Certainly those who've spoken out in a very small minority. And I guess we can understand why they've been reluctant to speak out, but it's been shocking. And it clearly goes against the grain of the very core essence of being a doctor.
So just before we go, you mentioned the students, and yes, University of Cape Town is very proud of the fact that we were the first university in the world to take externally displaced Gazan students. In fact, our numbers have increased bits. Johannesburg's got about, sorry about this stupid one, has got about 25, we've got 27 odd, and Pretoria's got 10. So we've got a decent cohort. It's a lot of effort and a lot of work, and the people who need an enormous amount of tribute paid to them are our deaneries and our academics coordinators. And certainly UCD deanery has been under huge pressure from Zionists in the university, have kept this going, and we have a number of heroes, which I won't mention for the moment. This is them arriving. This is about last June, an incredibly emotive moment when these first students arrived at our university and outside the medical school you just walked into. So this video I want to show, it's 2 minutes long. One of the reasons we're able to bring the students out here, one of the reasons we're able to do anything, is a completely brilliant South African organization, which is a complete national treasure, and that's Gift to the Givers. Gift to the Givers is remarkable. There's nothing like it in the whole wide world. And this was sent to me by Imtiaz Suleiman, the CEO and founder of it. And this is a video. That was a month ago, lady. I don't know about you, but I still tear up every time I watch that video. It's a remarkable thing. And yeah, what I wanted to ask you is, how does it influence your opinion on the possibility of rebuilding Gaza and healthcare services within Gaza?
Well, it just reinforces the hope that I retain every single day, and I think that one does get full of despair when one sees what's going on. But what's important to remember is all our Gazan friends and colleagues have hope every single day and do not give up hope. They are the most resourceful and most important, the most resilient people I've ever met in my life. I remember Hamis introducing me to someone years ago, maybe in 2014, 15, who was his friend who was rebuilding his house for the 5th time in 6 years or something because they've been bombed. So they are very resilient. So I absolutely am full of hope, and seeing something like that really just reinforces that hope. Someone I've got to know very well in the last 2 or 3 years is the Palestinian ambassador to the UK, Dr. Hussein Zomlot, who's a really inspirational speaker. He's from Gaza, and he told me recently, or he said in a speech, we were both speaking on the same panel, that every single morning, the first thing he does is the first thing he thinks of is his hope and his knowledge that things will be all right, that they will rebuild because they are such a remarkable people. And that just is utterly inspiring, Bob, isn't it?
Amazing. I'm going to ask you one last question, I think, then take questions. Have you got a few? Okay. You know, this is just a personal thing. You know, what you're sitting here is seeing 2 middle-aged white
Speak for yourself.
males. And in the end, you know, there are not many of us around doing this protesting thing and in our communities. But when we started all these protests and activism, the whole world protested, and we all thought that, you know, the world powers wouldn't tolerate what was happening in Gaza for more than a few months, and then Israel had to be forced back. But the months went on, and clearly there was no end in sight. And everyone thought we're going to get rather like, you know, donor fatigue, we're going to get protest fatigue, and people are going to stop turning up. In my opinion, they seem to have got stronger and stronger, and the world seems to be finding its moral conscience. This has been called the moral fulcrum of our era, Gaza. Which side do you stand on that fulcrum? Are you silent? Are you a participant? Are you an activist? I wondered what you thought about the strength of protest that continues worldwide and its future. Can we go on like this? Can we influence these bodies, or will protest fatigue eventually get us?
I agree with what you said. I don't think it will get to us. I think it will continue, and I think it's one of the just magnificent things that the world has shown, which is why I believe that that Palestine will be free, and I think it's why we all believe that. In Ireland, where Fnu and I have our little cottage, and it's just outside Cork, and Cork is a small city, but it's small. Every single Saturday since October the 7th, there's been a march of many thousands through Cork City. We do it whenever we're there. It's remarkable. My wife's been on marches in London when there's been nearly 1 million people march. I've seen marches over here. I've seen marches in Pakistan, all over the world. When Bruce George, who's a mutual friend of the two of us, he's doing a year in New Zealand. The day he arrived in Albany, he got off the plane, got a taxi, and the first thing the taxi came across was a massive pro-Palestine march. So it is wonderfully impressive, and I think the world opinion is absolutely in support of Gaza. There's no question in my mind, and it is having an effect. It's a slow effect, but I think it's absolutely having an effect, and it will be what wins the day, I think, for Gaza and Palestine.
So 2 things everyone has to do is get out there and be an activist, protest, and donate to give to the givers. Imtiaz will tell you it's the small donors that make the big difference. I'm going to stop there and ask questions from you, and we've got hands up in the audience. Please say your name. Thank you.
I can't, I can't begin to understand it. I think, as I said, it's against the very essential core of being a caregiver. So I cannot begin. But you know, you saw in Bob's talk some of those quotes from some of the politicians there. They believe the Palestinians are worse than animals. They're Well, they clearly do, some of them. Some of them, there have been a small number of very brave Israeli doctors who've stood up and said this is appalling what's going on. But many have been complicit in this. I think they genuinely do believe it. They're brought up to believe this from a very early age. But listen, there are evil people in all walks of life. We had one called Harold Shipman who killed lots and lots of people. He was a doctor, but he was a deeply evil. So there are people who are bad people who are doctors.
Sorry.
Sorry, before you answer, there's been a question, a request online to repeat the question. So
Yes.
online knows the question. And then also, I think we're probably going to have time for 2 more questions. So
The psychology of the Israelis that they can inflict this kind of terror upon people. Well, we're all human beings, and human beings across all cultures in all eras have behaved like this time. It's just tragic to watch what's going on here. But the fact is that in our own country, we saw the excesses of apartheid, and we saw how reasonable people became those who regarded black people as human animals and less than human animals and treated them as such. And Israel has been a deeply, deeply apartheid state for an awfully long time, driven by religious and nationalist fervor called the Zionist Project, started by Herzl in the 1880s. And that has given them a moral right, as they see it, in the same way as the Dutch Reformed Church used to justify apartheid in South Africa. So the Zionist Project has persuaded the Israelis that they're entitled to treat the Arabs like this, and so they do. And when you talk to young Israelis in Israel, you realize they have just been completely and utterly brainwashed in the same way as our young white people were brainwashed as they grew up in their Christian nationalist schools. It's brainwashing. It's a powerful tool.
is willing to help in Gaza, knowing what they face from these Israeli forces in terms of torture, murder, and how do doctors cope with what they have seen, experienced, and ultimately left?
So are international doctors prepared to go and work there, given all the terrible threats that they face, as Nick's shown, and how do they deal with traumas? How does Nick and his colleagues, afterwards, Nick said he only went in for a couple of weeks. It's how you cope, it's how your Gaza colleagues cope.
I mean, there have been no instances of, there have been some, a very small number of foreign humanitarian aid workers killed in attacks on vehicles. There's been no instances of any foreign doctors coming into Gaza being then kidnapped by the Israelis. But it is very clearly a dangerous place to be. But there are enormous numbers of people who have been volunteering to go in. Most can't get in, but MAP has a long waiting list of people who are keen to go in there. And other countries have done the same. I mean, a lot of the other Arab countries have Kuwait has sent a lot of people in, Qatar have sent a lot of people in, Egypt sent a lot of people in. So there are many, many people willing to go in there. And it is clearly at great risk to personal safety, but there are I think there are many people who, you know, as everyone here feels, it is so profoundly wrong what is happening to our Gazan friends and colleagues. It is so profoundly unjust. And many people have this sort of huge need, knowing that they can offer things in the healthcare provision, to get out there and help.
you want to start, Rosa?
So are there any more questions from the audience? Parjana's hand is up.
Should say two questions last, quick ones. We'll try and be quick in our answers. Hi, Susanna.
Thank you for there's been a lot of talk, a lot of interest in doctors, Israeli doctors' specifically in torture. What do you think, as the global medical fraternity, what actions do you think we should take in order to have accountability be realized in this regard? And the second one is, having first-hand experience seeing the systematic targeting of health, what are your personal opinions on the protection of healthcare workers and facilities that is afforded by the Geneva Conventions? How do you see that playing out in conflict zones over the next while?
So the first question was, how do we hold doctors being party to all this and have been involved in those torture camps? Israeli doctors have been heavily involved in those torture camps. How do we hold them accountable in due course? That was the first question. And the second one was, what kind of protection do we foresee the Geneva Conventions holding out for healthcare workers in this sort of scenario that provided pretty little so far? Perhaps you'd like to try and answer that.
Yeah, I mean, the international laws are very clear, aren't they? And that, which is why I picked that slide. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind. I mean, I guess the only thing that one could argue is that what I don't know is what is the intent there, but I mean, I think it's pretty clear. But certainly what's been done is seen to be against all the international laws. The laws are there, the laws are very clear, but they're not being upheld. And I think I mean, moving forward, what is so important is that those who have been guilty of these war crimes have to be held to account. And I don't just mean those in Israel. It's been profoundly upsetting to see certainly the US, to a lesser extent our country, be ambivalent. Well, the US to deny the role of the ICC and the ICJ, my country to be a bit ambivalent about it and to choose when they want to support and when they don't want to support it. We have two international courts who in slightly different ways have made it very, very clear that either there's a plausible genocide or they charge people with war crimes, genocide, and we've got our countries not supporting those international courts. So the rest of the world has got to make sure that these international courts are supported, and we've got to make sure that those who've perpetrated these war crimes and genocide are held to account. And that also includes those politicians in other countries who have been complicit. So I know for a fact there's a wonderful organisation called the International Centre of Justice for Palestinians in London, run by some senior lawyers who I've got to know very well. And they've collected a lot of evidence, and they have submitted all their evidence to the Metropolitan Police, requesting that our Prime Minister in the previous government and this government and foreign secretaries are charged with complicity to commit war crimes. Now, I think we all probably think that won't happen, but we know that those dossiers have gone to the Metropolitan Police, and the world has got to make sure these people are held to account.
One more. We had a question, last question over here.
In front.
I've heard there's a case involving a doctor at the Royal Free in London who was suspended after a complaint by an anonymous person to do with tweets that he had posted in connection with Gaza. My question is, what are your thoughts on that particular case? But also, what is the atmosphere like in Britain in terms of repression of medical professionals who speak up to regard the question?
So the question is, there's a case in the Royal Free of a doctor who's suspended because he had tweeted some stuff. And of course, we all know that the Zionist influences are massive, 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 massive. These hospitals, and Royal Free, of course, is a very Jewish hospital. And so that sort of thing is not only going on those, it's been going on widespread, have people being suspended and so on for taking a stance. Nick, talk to that more.
I think, I mean, it's appalling what's happened to him, and this happened to others. This happened to a great friend of ours who's in our Oxford Gaza group, chap who I went into Gaza with in December. who was suspended from his academic job at UCLA. She's now been reinstated. So there are many examples of this, and it's completely unacceptable. And I think most members of my profession are utterly silent about it. And you know, best I'm just embarrassed by them, but I think it's unacceptable to be silent. We need to stand up for them. And those of us that do, and for that example, we're lending all the support we can. The International Centre of Justice for Palestinians I talked about, which is run by a very senior law partner at one of the big London law firms, they are offering all legal advice free to those individuals. But we, as a profession, need to stand up. I think some people probably need to be a bit more sensible in what they tweet, but nevertheless. And so the final thing to say is that I think there are many, Bob and I have been talking about this before, there are many reasons I try and work out why people are so silent or don't want to engage on it. I think the predominant emotion, the prominent reason is cowardice. And I think that is by far the biggest one. They're frightened of being, if they go and support that Dr. Rafi, they're frightened they're going to be accused of being anti-Semitic. Apathy, ignorance, but in a small number, pure malice, that they know what they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and here in our own place, people will not confront South African Zionists. We're too frightened of offending our Jewish friends. We're all terrified of being accused of anti-Semitism. I would urge you, please, go and Google, when you've got 5 minutes, a thing called the Jerusalem Declaration, 2019. This is the definition of anti-Semitism that it should be. The Anti-Holocaust Association, which is the one which the Republicans and everyone uses to damn anyone who stands up against Zionism, declares that anyone who's against Israel and against Zionism is committing anti-Semitism. That's, of course, bollocks. Otherwise, you know, all our Jewish friends who are Jews for free South African Jews for free Palestine, etc., would all be guilty of anti-Semitism. Laughable. So what happened because of the dissatisfaction with that definition of anti-Semitism, Jerusalem, 2019, an enormous number of academics, Jewish and non-Jewish, got together for weeks to look at how you define anti-Semitism rationally. Go and Google it, Jerusalem 2019, Jerusalem Declaration 2019, to understand what true anti-Semitism is. And then do not be afraid to stand up to people who in our own communities are still painting Israel as the victim in the Middle East. It is the perpetrator.
Is there anything that you have found to be effective, particularly ineffective, when having conversations with these people? Because it feels like you show them the photo of the children who have been killed, and you show them photos of children who have been killed and the horrible horrors, and yet they remain silent. So if that doesn't move them, then
So the question is really, in the conversations with senior politicians in the US and in the UK, when they've been told categorically what's going on, why they haven't reacted and why hasn't gone anywhere? Is that?
Yeah. If invoking feelings of empathy doesn't work, is there anything else that works?
Okay. So yes, I think I approached a lot of those meetings with profound naivety, because I really thought, actually, if I showed them pictures of very, very damaged little children, they would react to, oh my God, I had no idea this was happening. But of course, it has had no such effect at all. I think there are individual politicians who are enormously sympathetic, and I've been to quite a few cross-party groups of members of Parliament who've been immensely sympathetic, but it's some of the small amount of leaders in both parties, and particularly on the right side of the Conservative Party, I don't understand their views. I mean, I think they are, it goes back to, I don't think they can be accused of cowardice. I think they know exactly what's going on, and I think that there is that a lot of them are very, very heavily influenced by the Jewish lobby in the UK, and perhaps financially influenced as well. And I think undoubtedly with some of them in the UK, that I mean, there's a lot of evidence now that some of our senior politicians in the Labour Party have received a lot of money from the Jewish lobby. So I don't know why they do not react in a human way the way the rest of us would react. Maybe that's why they've gone into politics.
Okay. My take-home message to you, please, is to go out there and be prepared to be activists. You know, don't be afraid. Don't hide your light under a bushel. Don't be cowards, as you said. I think that's a tough word, but nevertheless, just be prepared to stand up for what you know to be right and moral. It doesn't matter what you're. If you want to join an activism, there's every week. There is every Wednesday at St. George's Cathedral. There's a multi-faith vigil every week. Please go and join it. It's very moving. And my final take-home message is: please support the gift of the givers. Thank you. Your take-home message.
Very similar. Carry on what you're doing. I think that the power of people on the ground protesting, sharing what they learn from these sort of evenings, what they can learn from the media if you can learn something, but sharing it, protesting, boycotting, and doing everything you can to make sure these people are held to account.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Sadiq Mullah with Healthcare Workers for Palestine. So unlike Prof Maynard and Bob, I'm a physician and usually it's my job to correct them, but tonight they've done a superb job and I have nothing to add. So just a few thank yous. Firstly to Prof Maynard for coming down, for sharing your stories with us, your experiences and your insights. I think as healthcare workers in South Africa, we are used to working with limited resources in some pretty violent communities. But personally, despite that, the things you've shared today have really been difficult to stomach. And I think it would be possible to forget. I think, you know, what's happening in Gaza and the occupied West Bank is cast a very dark shadow over humanity. But, you know, with people like you who stand up and speak out, you know, it's a beacon of light. Then to Bob Baigrie, to Leslie London and the Department of Public Health, which is likely to thank you for making this evening possible. And then to the Health Justice Initiative for the sponsorship and for the Trees Outside, which please come and join us afterwards. And if you still got any few comments or questions, we'd like to chat to you.
And a shout out for Feroza.
And to Feroza, who's part of the Department of Public Health. The last comment into healthcare about healthcare workers for Palestine. So we're a national advocacy group. We're one of a number of similar organizations around the world who you know, advocate and stand in solidarity with the people of Palestine. We host talks like this, vigils, protests, fundraise, engage with the media and a number of other projects. So if you'd like to find out more, get more involved, please visit our website. It's hcw4Palestine.org.za. You can get links to our email address, mailing list, social media, and you also option to join our WhatsApp community. So we hope to see you there and to chat to you outside. Thank you.
Thank you.